recording? Yay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I think most of you know me. I'm Lori Gurman. I'm the state E-rate coordinator, and this is my 17th year doing this as a state coordinator. And so welcome. As we go through the information, if you have questions, please don't hesitate. Christine and I both are, monitoring the chat. You can put your questions there. But sometimes if the question is a little more involved, it might be easier, or if you type like I do, it might be easier just to unmute and ask your questions verbally, and you're more than welcome to do that. All right, so let's jump in. As Christine said, there is a lot of content. This is actually scaled back from what we've done in previous years. It's still a lot. Bear with me there. Okay, we can skip that one. All right, just a quick agenda for this afternoon. We'll start with an E-rate overview. So what is E-rate? Who's eligible, a little bit, and how the program works. We'll talk about eligible services and equipment. We'll talk about what's eligible, but also what's not eligible. All right, so some changes there, make you aware of all of that. We'll talk about program updates, what changes are coming, some good, some not so much, right? We'll cover those. We'll also talk about Category 2 budgets. Now, I know that, a lot of our libraries, up to this point, really has been utilized Cat 2 funds, but I want to make you aware, this is how it works. This is how much money you have available. All right, just again, so that you get the full picture of, what is E-rate. We'll talk about the application process. Now with E-rate, I like to say there's an E-rate, form for everything. All right, so we'll talk about, the various forms. When do you file these? When do you get an exemption, a pass, so you don't have to file, a specific form? Those are very, very limited. All right, but we'll talk about that. Again, all of those various steps. And then we'll finish the afternoon off with looking at the portal. Now, on the library side, there's not as much, stuff that you change in the portal, but it is very important to understand, like, where do you go in to add users? The portal is great, lots of things you can do in the portal, but like I said, this is my 17th year as state coordinator. We've had this portal since 2016. And, I hear the comment a lot. It's not user-friendly. All right, so some of this is just understanding where information is housed. So I'll show you some of that. But it's also very important that if you are thinking you might apply for Category 2 funds, it's very important that you make sure that your square footage is listed for each and every library branch, because I'll be showing you how your budget basically is calculated. All right, so again, very important that the portal is updated for the most current information. Square footage, if you have a new branch coming online, making sure that that branch is represented in the portal, making sure that street addresses are correct. All right, again, where to find find that information within the portal. Okay, so let's just jump in. What is E-rate? Well, so E-rate actually came about based 1996 with the Telecommunication Act. All right, an act that came from Congress that then directed the FCC to develop what we call the Universal Service Fund. All right, and the USF, it actually funds 4 different programs. E-rate is just one of those 4. Now, the program, it's now capped at a whopping just a little over $5 billion. When the program first started, up until probably the first 10 years, it remained static at $2.25 billion. The other 3 programs within the USF, those programs, were basically increased to meet inflation. For the longest time, E-rate was not. All right, but the FCC has basically corrected that over the past, I don't know, 5-6 years. Now, E-rate, it does not cover 100% of the eligible cost. All right, it's going to range anywhere from 20 to 90%. And we'll talk about how is that percentage determined. All right, but a couple of program principles to be aware of. All right, all equipment and service. All right, with a couple of exceptions, and we'll cover those. You have to start with basically competitively bidding. All right, and we do this within the E-rate portal. So again, any service, it could be internet bandwidth, all right, anything under category 2, which I'll explain, what's eligible there, you always have to start with the bidding form. But like I said, there are 2 exceptions, and I'll explain those. All right, but again, that's the first E-rate rule. Now, also the other thing, I mentioned that E-rate covers anywhere from 20 to 90% of the cost. All right. So, once you see how, what is your discount rate? Let's say, as an example, it's 80%. You would have to show that you pay your 20%. All right. And again, it's really important that you show that you've met that. All right. You have to pay your share. Now, I mentioned that, when the Telecommunication Act came into being, the FCC, was directed, to form this program. And so the FCC sets the rules. So you'll hear me talk about, we're waiting on the FCC to make this decision. All right. They set the rules and the policies. But they have contracted with USAC, the Universal Service Administrative Company. All right. That's a mouthful. USAC is an independent, not-for-profit organization, all right, that the FCC designated to manage, the day-to-day program operation, the application process. So it's typically, individuals from USAC that we interact with. Now, it's also important to know that we typically start the process for the next funding year 6 to 12 months in advance, right? Depending on what it is you're looking for, how long your procurement process takes, all right? But again, we start it months in advance. Now, the program is also very highly deadline driven, right? So I'll talk about all these different forms and how the deadlines for each of those forms, how those are determined. The other thing with E-rate is it's typical to have basically to be managing up to 3 different funding years at any given time. All right. So we are currently in what's called funding year 2025. You may still need some E-rate form filed to finish out 2024. And here we are talking about, starting the process to apply for 2026. All right. So it's a little bit of a juggling act, but it is definitely doable. Okay, so now when I mentioned funding year, all right, I know like for schools, with school treasurers, it can get confusing, when we're thinking of a fiscal year versus a funding year. All right, so with E-rate, we always classify the funding year based on when the services typically start. And for most applicants, that is July 1st. All right, so we're currently in funding year 2025, meaning services that began July 1, 2025. All right. And then end what we call recurring service, like our internet or bandwidth, all right, will end June 30th, 2026. All right. So then funding year 2026 will start July 1, 2026 and June 30th, 2027. All right. So again, that can be a little confusing. So when we say FY 2025, that means funding year 2025. Now, we talk about services, installation of services. There are 2 types of service to be aware of. One is what we call recurring service. All right. So it's delivered during the 12 months of the funding year. So July 1 through June 30th. Recurring service means just that, something like your internet, your bandwidth, where, you may be invoiced on a monthly basis. You receive that service, month after month. All right. So again, the way your invoice can vary. I think most of our libraries are invoiced on a monthly basis for that type of service. All right. But again, that covers July 1 through June 30th of the funding year. Non-recurring, this would be equipment and installation of equipment. So if you are applying for category 2, what we call internal connections, that means equipment like routers, switches, access points, structured cabling, if you need to run, say, an Ethernet drop. All right, that is non-recurring. You're purchasing it, typically it's one time. All right, so we call that non-recurring service. Now, with non-recurring, this does get a little confusing, all right, but we do get the benefit of starting with, basically to start receive the equipment as early as April 1st, so 90 days before the start of the funding year. The reason that is, you want to make sure that, the equipment can be installed so that things are ready by July 1st. So if there's some recurring service, that's going to rely on that equipment installation, that you can get that equipment, delivered and get it installed before the start of the funding year. All right. So again, we get the benefit of receiving the equipment as much as 90 days before the start of the upcoming funding year. Now, because a lot of applicants will wait until after you receive a funding letter. All right. That's typical. There's no rhyme or reason as to when you might receive that actual funding letter. All right. So we actually get 90 days on the back end of the funding year as well. So where recurring service covers 12 months, July 1 through June 30th, purchasing that non-recurring equipment, getting it installed, we actually have the benefit of 18 months. So the earliest that you can receive the equipment is April 1st, all right, whether you've received a funding decision or not. All right. And then you actually, so this upcoming funding year, you would have from April 1, 2026 until September 30th, 2027, all right, to get that equipment purchased and the installation complete. This actually works really well if you're looking at, say, a new construction project. Go back and look at the time frame. All right. Will you be ready to purchase that connectivity equipment? Start that installation somewhere within that 18 months. If so, then you want to plan on applying, right, for this 2026 funding year, if it falls anywhere within that 18-month period. And again, please let me know if you have questions there. And also, some of you have attended my training before. I get into my groove and I just start talking. If I need to slow down, please let me know that. All right, so who is eligible? All right, well, since this is library-specific training, we're going to focus on that. So public libraries, if you're eligible for LSTA funding, all right, then you're eligible to apply for E-rate. That includes bookmobiles. If you have, kiosks, all right, those are eligible. All right, well, I'm not going to get into describing the eligibility for schools here. Now we do have what we call NIFs. I see this more on the school side, but I have seen some libraries that might have this, where a NIF is what we call a non-instructional facility. All right, that's the term that the FCC uses. So this is a facility that is not open to the public, that doesn't serve, that doesn't patrons don't have, access to. It could be a separate data center. It could be a separate admin building. All right. So those buildings do qualify for some level of service. We'll talk about, when do they not qualify. All right. But if you do have that, that admin building, that data center, again, not open to your patrons. All right. If they're receiving E-rate eligible services, you want to make sure that they're included in the E-rate portal, because when you apply for service, one of the questions it's going to ask as you're making application, it's who's receiving the service, who's the recipient of service. So if it's, bandwidth for that admin building, you want to make sure that they're in the portal. Now, for a library system, right, where you've got the main library and then you have your branches, you've got that bookmobile, right? You're going to have multiple, what we call entity numbers, all right? So the library system, that would be basically the portal is a parent-child relationship. All right, so the library system would have a designation, right, as a parent with a billed entity number. If you're an independent library, you have no branches under you, all right, you're still going to have that single bin, right, that billed entity number. But again, if it's a library branch, then you're going to also have those child entity numbers. Now, the entity number is unique to the E-rate program. All right. It has nothing to do with your FSCS number. That never rolls off my tongue. I'm sorry if I said that acronym wrong. All right. But entity numbers are unique to the E-rate program, not used for anything else. All right. Now, if you do have a new building, maybe again, that new construction, opening a new branch, we cannot create those entity numbers ourselves. You would have to reach out to USAC and request that they create the entity number for you and add it to the portal underneath your library system. All right, but again, USAC would have to do that for us. Right now, I've mentioned the portal maybe a couple of times. All right, this is this portal. This is where we do, all of our work. We file all of our forms. We ask for that, invoice extension if needed. This is where, we put in square footage for, for our branches. This is also where if you needed to create a new user, all of that's done within the portal. All right. Now, you can have multiple users, within, your portal structure. All right. But you have to have one. So if there's only one user currently in your library's, portal, then that single individual then would be designated as what we call the AA, the account administrator. All right. But we can only have one AA. All right. The system will not allow for a second one. However, the account administrator, they have the rights, in addition to filing the forms, the account administrator, have the authority, the rights to create other users. So you can definitely have multiple users in the portal, but only one designated as the AA. All right. So you can add a second, third user. You can go in for those new users, assign rights. You can indicate if they have what we call full rights. That means they can fill out all the forms, submit the forms. You can have what we call a partial right, meaning that they can fill in, that individual can fill in the fields on the form, but they would not have the authority to make the certifications at the end and submit the application. And then we can also have what we call view only users. All right. So again, you can add additional users, assign the rights, however you choose. All right. So for a library, right, library system, how are your discounts calculated? If you're an independent library, then it's based on wherever that independent library is located, what school system, is within the same footprint. All right. And then it's based on that school district's enrollment information and the count for the National School Lunch Program. So whatever discount that school district gets, that independent library would qualify for the same discount percentage. All right. Now, it is based on, as I said, that school district, the school district's enrollment, how many students are enrolled, and then how many of those students are eligible for the National School Lunch Program. And then it's also whether or not you're in an urban or rural designated area. All right. Now, that is based on census data. It is what it is. Most current census data is from 2020. All right. But again, that's already listed in the portal. Now, if you're a library system, right, with the main library and then your branches, then it's going to depend on wherever the main library is situated, all right, wherever that main library is located. Doesn't matter, about, as far as if there are branches served by a different school district, all right, it's tied to wherever the main library is located and the school district within that footprint. All right. And then basically everybody, all the branches receive the same discount rate. Now, one difference here is if you do have, multiple branches, each branch will be designated whether it is urban or rural. So in this case, it could change the discount rate a bit compared to what the school district that serves the main location. All right. Because again, if it's a county-wide library system, all right, it's where those branches located. It comes down to the zip code, right? Wherever you're, whatever that zip code, there's a lookup, within the census, data, the database, all right, and whichever is the majority, all right. So again, it's based on, like I said, that enrollment, lunch information based on the main library's school district, and then that urban rural designation. So this is what it looks like. All right. So now I will show you here broken out by category 1 versus category 2 and explain the difference here. All right. So when we look at if you're an independent library or that library system, all right, first it's going to look at, as I said, that school district's information. So what percentage of students qualify for the National School Lunch Program? All right. So let's say that's 29%. All right. So we look at the discount matrix. And we see that falls within this band here, the 20 to 34%. All right. Now we see two different discount rates. All right. Urban versus rural. So if this is an urban designated where the majority of the libraries within the library system are urban, all right, then we can see that they would receive a 50% discount rate. Now, if it's a rural designation, you can see they get a little higher discount rate, 60%. All right. Well, keep in mind that, because I get this question often, why is this? It costs more to get, bandwidth internet access into those rural areas sometimes. All right. So that's why rural locations do get that benefit of a little higher discount rate. But once we hit 80%, it's the same across the board. All right. So same for urban as rural. Now, one thing to point out here, the reason I show both Cat 1 and Cat 2, once we hit the highest discount rate, remember I said, for, services 20 to 90%. So if you're at the highest discount rate, all right, 90% for category 1, as we read over to the right, Cat 2, the maximum that E-rate will cover is 85%. All right, everything else remains the same. All right, same thing for Cat 1 versus Cat 2. It's only when you're at the highest discount rate. The FCC basically said you have to have more skin in the game. You have to pay, a little bit higher portion in hopes of making a little bit better purchasing decisions. All right, but again, that's how it works. All right, and please, as I said, let me know if I need to slow down. Let me know if you have any questions at all. So I've mentioned this category 1 versus category 2. The easiest way to understand the difference here is category 1, these are services that go to the library. All right. So bandwidth, whether you're getting a fiber connection, is this a DSL, cable connection? All right. So again, that circuit going to the library, right, to be able to connect them to the outside world. All right. So again, it could be the bandwidth. It's also the internet access. We've talked about that the maximum discount rate is 90%. There are no funding caps with category 1. All right. The cost is what it is, as long as it's cost effective, right? We can't have vendors come in and say, oh, you're getting E-rate, and E-rate's going to cover, 80% of your cost. We can, double your rate because you don't have to pay as much. E-rate's covering it. That's against the rules. All right. What we call vendors, service providers, have to obey what it's called the lowest corresponding price, LCP. What that means simply is a vendor, a service provider, has to charge the library the same, a school or library, the same thing, the same cost that they're charging, any local business, right? They cannot up your rate just because you're getting E-rate. As I said, that's against the rules. Now, category 1, this is what we call recurring service, right? And so it's going to cover July 1 through June 30th. Now, all buildings are eligible for category 1, right? Whether it is that library branch or that NIF, right? That separate admin building, the data center. All right. So all buildings are eligible for the category 1. So that service to the building. Category 2, this is, it could be a service or equipment that goes inside the library. All right. Now, those NIFs that, if it's a separate admin building, data center, those sites do not qualify for Cat 2 funding. All right. So, and there's a caveat there. I'll explain it. But if it's equipment that's only going to serve that separate admin building, say some access points, right, E-rate's not going to cover that cost. All right. They do not qualify. Now, if that admin building is your, basically your NOC, that's where your wiring rack is. So your branches, connect back to that building, and you need to put in a router or a core switch or something that's going to serve the branches. In that case, because it's not going to serve just that admin building, it's actually serving the library branches, you can, in that case, have the equipment installed in that facility, because again, it's not serving just that building. All right, I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions. Now, with category 2, currently the way the program is working, there are 3 subcategories under category 2. All right, the first is what we call internal connections. That's the actual equipment, structured cabling. There's also what we call basic maintenance of internal connections. So just that, right? The basic level of maintenance for that eligible equipment, router, switches, access points, and so on. All right, the third service type is what we call MIBS, Managed Internal Broadband Service. This is where you're contracting with a third party, all right, a service provider, who provides the management, the monitoring of your LAN or WAN. All right, so you could contract with the company, maybe you have very limited IT staff. you could contract with a company to provide that management, right? That monitoring of your network. Now, I mentioned, the max discount rate is at 85%. Where Cat 1 does not have a budget, Cat 2 does. All right. And it's subject to a 5-year budget cycle. So we're going to be talking a lot this afternoon about the new budget cycle that's coming up, that's going to start with the 2026 funding year. All right. So, and how those are going to be calculated, because those dollar amounts went up. Now, I mentioned that equipment can be received as early as April 1st. All right, through September, the following, or excuse me, 18 months later, September 30th. So you have that 18 months to get the equipment purchased and installed. And NIFs, all right, not eligible. All right, let's look a little bit closer under category when we talk about category 1. Break it down just a little bit more. So most common under category 1 is least lit fiber. That's what, a lot of our library sites use, where you're contracted, with local telco, local ISP, be that, Spectrum, AT&T, whoever, right? So least lit fiber. There's also cable modem, DSL service. It may be a small library branch where you really don't need that leased fiber, that because it typically costs more than a DSL service, right? So again, look at your needs, would a DSL option, would that benefit you? And then we also have what we call bundled internet access, right? So basically it's internet access along with the circuit. Okay, similar to what you would see if you did like a cable modem, a DSL, you're getting the circuit as well as, access to the internet. Okay, it's just bundled together. Now, a couple of other options here. I don't see many libraries applying for this. I see a lot of schools, but just so that you know, you could contract for something called leased dark fiber. This simply means, this is the way the FCC defines it, where someone else owns the fiber, but you're responsible for lighting it. We see this maybe in a large city, where, maybe the local municipality, they're running fiber, around the city, and it's, we can make this available, often there's a cost, to use the fiber. All right. So, but, we're running it right past this branch location, we'll give you access to this fiber. All right. But in this case, say the municipality will not pay for the electronics to light the fiber. All right. So your library would be required to purchase that equipment to light it. That's why it's called dark. It means that whoever's providing the service, right, would not be lighting it. The other option here is what we call self-provision fiber. It could be fiber. It could be a microwave tower. It's not, it's not, limited to fiber. There could be other options there. This is where, though, you build it and you own it. It's yours. You pay to trench, lay the fiber. Like I said, I don't see as many libraries using this. I see it more on the school side, but it is eligible. The construction cost and all of that. Now, also eligible, you can see every flavor, I'm going to say, of fiber, different connection types, whether it's satellite service, the microwave, and so on. Now, I did put here wireless data plans, and we're going to be talking quite a bit this afternoon about data plans, but I want to make it clear here, all right? Very, a very different eligibility here. So wireless data plans are eligible when it's to serve one of your library facilities. It could, like your bookmobile, if you've got a traveling kiosk, right, where you're going to travel around the county, community centers, wherever. All right, and so you need a hotspot to be able to conduct library business. Those are still eligible. All right, these are typically the most cost-effective way, the only way, right, to get access, say, for that bookmobile. All right, or that kiosk. Those are eligible. Those have been eligible under E-rate. All right, so nothing has changed there. Now, it's important, you need to know what's eligible, but also what's not eligible. So not eligible, voice service, all right off the bat. Anything that's providing, any service that's providing a dial tone is not eligible. So if you're putting in a new phone service, right, E-rate's not going to cover it. If it's your local, maybe you still have a landline, where you're paying for local long distance, charges. All right. E-rate's not going to cover that. Or cell phone service. Again, if it gives you a dial tone, E-rate's not going to cover it. They basically phased out, this is starting back in like 2018, they started phasing out phone service when they made category 2 eligible. All right. So again, it's like, okay, we can't afford both. All right. So we'll do away with the voice service. Now, redundant services. So if you needed a second fiber connection, in case your primary goes out, all right, E-rate's not going to cover for that redundant circuit. All right, there's just not enough money in the fund to pay for that redundancy. And the last thing here to point out with category 1, if you are applying for anything under category 2, all right, you're required to be SEPA compliant, all right, which means, filtering. Now, when we talk about filtering, it's, the FCC says you have to filter for, pornographic, obscene depictions. All right. Outside of that, it's up to you as to what to filter. All right. So to be SEPA compliant, you show that you're filtering, for, again, that type content. But if there is a cost for the filtering, E-rate's not going to cover that filtering cost. Right. But I do know Oakland does provide filtering services. Is that correct? Christine. I was just talking to a Charlene earlier.
Yes, I'm sorry. Had to turn on the video and the audio. Yes.
Yeah.
So absolutely, Lori, if you your library does not have a local filtering solution and you're looking for help to be SEPA compliant, again, it's a relatively light hand. You do also, and I think you said this, Lori, you do also need to make sure you have a written policy that is publicly available, and you have to have keep copies of the board meeting minutes where you go through this. But if you are looking at trying to find a solution, a technology solution, we absolutely can help you with that. That is no problem and no additional cost to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Christine mentioned, I started to say Charlene again, I'm sorry. As Christine mentioned, we also have to have an acceptable use policy. I know most libraries have something already in place. If you're not currently SEPA compliant, you would just need to update that policy, so that patrons understand, that if it's a minor, basically that you're filtering, all right, and then you keep copies of those. Right. And, at the point that, you have a board meeting and you've made this decision that, yes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to become SEPA compliant. You keep copies of the board minutes, showing, where that's been memorialized. All right. That you've made this decision. All right, now I mentioned that there are a couple of bidding exemptions. This is the first. This is a bidding exemption for category 1, under category 1. All right, and I've seen a lot of our library, like the smaller library branches use this. So it's referred to as CABIO, commercially available bundled internet option. All right, so this is simply, a commercially available business class internet, right? That, your local ISP in town, could provide, to you or any business in town. All right. So the FCC says if you meet certain criteria, that it's already cost effective, so you don't have to file the form 470. The 470 is the bidding form. All right. So you get a pass, right? You don't have to go out to bid. This is already cost effective. All right. But like I said, it's whatever commercially available, right? That local ISP is already providing in town for local businesses. Now, to qualify, this first one, pretty easy to meet, right? The minimum speed has to be, all right, at a minimum of 100 meg by 10. All right, so 100 meg downstream, 10 meg upstream. All right, and most of the services, it's that as an absolute minimum. Okay, here's the other requirement. The cost must be $3,600 or less annually. We call that pre-discount, right? Before any, E-rate discount percentages are applied, right? So it basically comes out to no more than $300 per month, right? Per library site, right? It's not the combined total if you have 3 different branches using this, all right? It's no more than $3,600 annually per library branch, all right? So again, really geared, but not limited to, small libraries, small school systems. Again, let me know if you have questions there. Now, while you don't have to go through the bidding route, right, all the other E-rate forms have to be filed if you're using CABIO. We just get a pass on the bidding requirement. All right, let's talk a little bit about category 2. I mentioned these 3 different subcategories. We're going to look at this a little more, granular, what's included in that. Again, all of that connectivity equipment. E-rate does not cover, we'll talk about this as far as what's not eligible. E-rate does not cover end user devices. So if you needed to buy some tablets, right, some laptops, E-rate's not going to cover that. All right. It covers the connectivity components. So if you need wireless access points, so a controller, routers or switches. I mentioned if you needed to run some new Ethernet, drops. If you wanted to run fiber, maybe you have 2 different, wiring closets, and you want to run fiber to connect to, depending on, your network size. Right, structured cabling, the cost of the material, the labor, the installation. When we talk about servers, just be mindful, the only servers currently eligible under E-rate are caching servers. If you have a general file server where applications, user files are stored, okay, that server is not eligible. Now, firewall appliances, a UPS, a rack, those items are eligible. Firewall appliance, E-rate covers a basic firewall, right? Basic functionality. So depending on, if you're looking at applying for a firewall appliance, depending on how robust you want that appliance, E-rate may not cover all of the cost. The more functionality that gets rolled into that appliance, basically it's moving from a basic level to a more advanced level. E-rate covers the basic level. All right. And sometimes it's hard to know, well, what percentage is eligible. Most service providers, or I should say manufacturers, report that information out on their website. They also report it to USAC. All right. So, I strongly recommend, if you're looking at a firewall appliance, go out and check the manufacturer's site. And I've got some URLs that I'll share with you, just to make sure, what percentage is eligible. And then you can make an informed decision. Do I really want all that functionality? But E-rate's only going to cover, that only 70% of it is considered eligible, right? You can make that decision. All right. But again, it covers a basic appliance. Racks and UPSs, those are basically to support the eligible equipment. All right. So if you ask E-rate to cover the cost of a UPS, a common review question we'll get, it's, what are you going to plug into that UPS? And it seems kind of like a silly question, right? But I mentioned that a general file server is not eligible. So if you have a rack mounted file server, right, and you're plugging it into that UPS, the reviewers are going to want to know, are you plugging something ineligible into that component, right? So if you're plugging it into that UPS, then a portion of the cost of that UPS would be considered ineligible because you're plugging in eligible equipment. That's when I was like, okay, if you've got another UPS, that could serve the file server, plug the file server into that. I know this is really splitting hairs, but it's how the program works. Now, equipment licenses, let's say you're buying, it varies based on the manufacturer. Let's say the make model that you're going with requires a right to use license, right? It's basically the software, right? The client that allows that equipment to function. Without it, it's a chunk of plastic, right? So those licenses are eligible. You can even ask for, say, a 3-year or 5-year subscription. You could go ahead and pay for that full subscription up front, right? Again, it's just right to use, and USAC or E-rate would cover that. All right, even if you're paying for multiple years up front, you can pay for it and then get reimbursed all in 1 year. Now, if there's some functionality that you can get cloud-based, so if it's cloud-based controller, cloud-based firewall, it's providing that eligible functionality, you can still get it, cloud-based. You don't have to have the physical piece of equipment. E-rate covers the installation and configuration of any of this eligible equipment. So if you're paying, the service provider to come and install the switches and the APs and run those Ethernet drops, right? The material cost, the installation, that would be eligible. If there's any taxes and fees, right? And any basic training on the use of the equipment. This would be to train the IT staff, not to train your library staff in general, right? It's specific to that equipment. Okay, so things not eligible, again, it's important to know that cybersecurity, right? So E-rate covers that basic firewall. The advanced functionality, E-rate does not cover. All right. Now, you may have heard there's a cybersecurity pilot that the FCC has initiated. The application period for that has ended. Nationwide, the FCC chose, pilot participants. It's to be a 3-year pilot. Let's see how this goes, right? And then the FCC could then, basically say, okay, E-rate's now going to cover cybersecurity. As it stands right now, as it stands today, cybersecurity is not eligible. The reason I am stressing this, I've heard from a number of vendors that they're confusing the cybersecurity pilot with the E-rate program and reaching out to schools and libraries saying, oh, E-rate's now covering this. All right, it is not. All right. So again, don't be confused. E-rate will not cover storage devices. So if you have a backup system, maybe it's a cloud-based backup system, E-rate's not going to cover that. I mentioned anything having to do with voice. So if you're putting in a new phone system, VoIP gateway, all of that, handsets, E-rate's not going to cover it. End user devices, security cameras, and then that advanced firewall that I mentioned. Okay, here's the second bidding exemption to be aware of. The first one I mentioned, the CABIO, that is specific to Category 1. All right, well, there's also a Category 2 bidding exemption, and it's interesting, it only applies, at least in Ohio, it's libraries and then like our tribal library applicants, libraries or schools. All right, we have no tribal libraries or schools in our state. All right, so small libraries. All right. So there is this Category 2 bidding exemption. Let's say you just need, maybe, 5, 6, Ubiquity APs, right? Where you can get those for just, a few $100s a piece, right? So if the pre-discount amount, right, before any E-rate, discounts are applied, if the cost is $3,600 or less, you don't have to file that bidding form, right? You can move, straight to the second form in the process, the 471, and say, okay, here's the make and model of the APs we're asking for. Here's the cost for the APs. Here's the name of the vendor, right? And you get to, you get another pass here on that bidding form. All right. But if the total pre-discount amount is $3,612, you don't qualify. All right. This is the max. But again, it's great that they're making that available for our libraries. I mentioned about, I gave the example like with the firewall, having ineligible functionality, it's that advanced functionality. USAC has said, that you could call their help desk because the manufacturers report this to USAC each year, right? Here's our new, make, model, the SKUs, and here's the percentage of eligibility. Okay. Sometimes it depends on the luck of the draw, right? Which, who do you get when you call the help desk? Sometimes they'll be able to find the information for you, but not always. So I have been collecting URLs, I'm strange that way, of different manufacturers, right? So each manufacturer handles this a little bit differently, how they, provide that information. Cisco Meraki, if you go to their site, if you pull up this presentation, the URLs are embedded there. So Cisco Meraki, if you go to their site, you can put in, that description, if you've got a specific SKU, and then it's going to show you. So we can see here that this first, the Catalyst 9400, this is an old screenshot that I grabbed. It shows that it's 100% eligible. So if that device is $3,000, then $3,000 times your discount rate is what E-rate's going to cover. All right, but we can see that the 9400 series is 79% eligible. that means that there's ineligible functionality, all right, in that component. So it could be a redundant port. E-rate doesn't cover redundancy. It could be maybe there's a VoIP port, right? Again, the manufacturer has identified that. So in this case, it says this component is 79% eligible. So right off the top, 21% of that cost you would have to pay out of pocket. All right, if you went with an item like this. And then E-rate would then, let's say you're at an 80% discount rate, that 80% would apply to the remaining eligible portion. All right, just to give you the heads up, so there are no surprises. All right, but again, here's just some of the manufacturers, if you're looking at any of these. But it's also a good idea when you go to file that, if you're filing that 470, that bidding form, you can put on the bidding form as a bidding requirement that the vendor, must identify any ineligible cost. All right. So again, so you don't have surprises down the road. All right, just a real quick here. I've already talked about this a bit, but again, beating you over the head with it. Sorry. If it is that non-recurring service or that equipment, the installation of that equipment, you do have that 18-month period. So, like I said, if you're looking at a construction project, will the need for that equipment, the installation to take place during that 18-month period, then apply for E-rate for this 2026 funding year, and you'll have that 18 months. This is a little complicated to explain, especially if you're new. I do want to make you aware. I mentioned that one of the subcategories under Category 2 is basic maintenance. All right, and the way that it's currently defined is there's basically two different types, two different flavors, right, of basic maintenance. One is what we call in-person service. All right, so this is where you have a technician that comes on site, does repairs, it's time and material. All right, the other option is what we call remote service. This is really basic maintenance, right? This is at the most basic level. Right, so you could pay for a support that includes, it's all remote. So it's, you have a help desk number. It's where you can go online, you go out to this URL where you can get technical support, pull down maybe configuration changes, bug fixes, patches, firmware updates, and so on. All right. Again, that's the most basic level remote service. Right, so the equipment being maintained, first off, it has to be eligible equipment, right? So if it's an ineligible server and you need maintenance on it, well, because the server is not eligible, you can't get maintenance on it. All right, so again, it has to be that eligible equipment. Now, when we look at these two different types of maintenance, when it's in person, all right, that on-site repair, time and materials, if you pay, let's say you contract for a maintenance, right, contract for this level of service, let's say it's $10,000, right? You would have to keep a repair log. Now, I don't see, as I see more of our like large, metropolitan library systems apply for this, right? But you would keep a log, what device was, repaired. So the make and model, all right. So let's say it's that, core switch, how much time was spent. All right. So my point here is you keep track of the repairs. Let's say the cost is $10,000 and you have a 1-year contract. All right. Let's say you have no occurrences at all. Nothing, the equipment doesn't fail. Right. You've contracted with the company to pay them $10,000. If you had no occurrence, right, no repair needed, E-rate's not going to cover it. Let's say you did have an occurrence, but the total cost, the time and material was $2,000. Well, then E-rate would only cover your discount rate of the $2,000, what you actually spent. So basically, E-rate's not going to cover an insurance policy, all right, is the way the FCC has explained it in the past. Right, the remote services, again, this is the most basic level. So you could contract with this, say, for 1 year. basically whether you use a service or not, it really is the most basic. Let's say the cost of this is maybe $1,000. You go ahead, you pay the $1,000. Whether you use it or not, E-rate would go ahead and reimburse you for that. All right. So again, because it does meet that definition of that most basic level. Now, when we talk about maintenance, it does follow that recurring service, time frame, July 1 through June 30th. It does not follow that hardware, 18-month pattern there. All right, so just I think we've already covered this pretty much. All right, so again, repair and upkeep of the eligible equipment would be that in person, right? If you've got maybe you have a contract for cable maintenance, right? If you have an issue, say with an Ethernet drop, right? So again, where somebody comes on site versus the remote service. Now, if you are applying for this type service, when we file the 470, you have to ask for it under that subcategory called basic maintenance. All right. First, you have to put it on the bidding form under that subcategory. When you file the next form in the process, say that 471, right? Again, you ask for it under basic maintenance. The reason I'm explaining this the way I am, there are some very specific rules around basic maintenance that have been problematic. So the FCC is looking at making some, possible changes, and I'll explain what those look like. Okay. Now, exclusions here, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but again, internal equipment, if you're buying the equipment, it is just that, the equipment, right? Let's say you're buying some equipment and the manufacturer warranty, maybe it's only 60 days or 90 days. If they offer, some extended manufacturer warranty, all right, that is not eligible. Okay. It's whatever manufacturer warranty is bundled in with the equipment. All right. And we'll talk later about MIBS. Right. Now, when you're buying, I mentioned under internal connections, getting right to use license, it really is just that, the operating system to use that equipment. When it really is just the right to use, that falls under internal connections. All right, so this is why I'm explaining this the way I am. This is all brand new. So each year, the FCC releases what they call the draft version of the eligible service list, okay, the ESL. And it'll say, okay, for the upcoming funding year, here are all the items that we propose to be eligible under E-rate. Here's everything under category 1. Here are the things under category 2. Most years, we don't see a lot of changes. The last couple, it's been a little different story. All right. So again, the FCC just released this last week. Here's the draft version. When in the currently up to today, right, under the current version of the eligible service list, if you're asking for a right to use license, I mentioned that under internal connections, where you could go ahead and request a 5-year subscription for those license. You could go ahead and pay for all 5 years up front. You could go ahead, once you get a funding letter, go ahead and ask for the reimbursement for all 5 years, right? And that first year, not a problem. Where we find, a big issue is, let's say you have some access points. Maybe you've had them, maybe you had a 3-year, right to use subscription for those APs. Well, that subscription term is about to run out. So you need to renew those license, right? The APs still function. You don't want to replace the equipment. You just need to renew the license. Typically, most manufacturers, when you do the license renewal, they also they bundle in that very basic level of support. So, because again, the manufacturer warranties run out, so they'll bundle in this very basic support. So if you need bug fixes, patches, firmware updates, that's just bundled in. Under the current rules, and I apologize because this is really in the weeds, under the current rules, if you do that license renewal that includes support, even though it is, it does include the right to use license, the rule has been that we have to ask for it under basic maintenance, not internal connections. Okay, so when we ask for it under basic maintenance, let's say, okay, we're going to do this, let's do a 5-year subscription so we don't have to go out to bid again, for 5 years. If it falls under basic maintenance, right, because this renewal includes support, you go ahead and you get invoiced for those 5 years up front. Let's say it's $10,000. Because this is defined as basic maintenance, now the basic maintenance rules kick in. All right. And the basic maintenance rules say, even if you have to pay in year one the full, 5-year cost, in this case, $10,000, you can only ask for E-rate to basically reimburse you for 1 year's cost, an annual cost, right? That year's cost each year for 5 years. Even though you paid for it up front, it has caused a lot of issues, a lot of heartburn. All right. So the FCC is proposing, after much begging, all right, being quite honest, much begging, when it is this right to use that happens to include the support, make it eligible under internal connections, just like the brand new right to use license. And the FCC is looking at implementing that. I apologize for the long explanation, but it is a huge impact. I've seen it, major issues for both schools as well as libraries. Okay, so that again, that's what they are proposing. So, if this is, if it is approved, which we're definitely keeping our fingers crossed, we would basically then, we would still have basic maintenance, but the basic maintenance would be that fixed maintenance contract, that on-site time and material. So we'd still have basic maintenance available for that type service. All right. But any license renewal that might include support, it would then go under internal connections. You can pay for all, multi-years up front and go ahead and get reimbursed. No more, splitting this out. All right. So again, I hope that made sense. Like I said, it's been very problematic this past 5 years. Okay, so another service that is eligible, I mentioned the MIBS, the Managed Internal Broadband Service. So again, this is where, if you want to contract for this, you have to list it on the Form 470. And this is where you're looking at contracting with the provider to provide that monitoring, that management of your equipment. Now, anything under Cat 2, whether it's internal connections, the basic maintenance, or this MIBS service, this all comes out of that Cat 2 budget that I mentioned. All right, so it is subject to that cap. All right. Now, with MIBS, you have one or two options. Maybe you already have all the equipment. You have switches and you have access points, right? You're not looking at replacing that equipment right now. You could still contract with a vendor to do that management for you. All right. The other option, though, you could also say, okay, we want the management, but maybe we need to do a hardware refresh. Maybe we need all new APs. You could say, okay, I want to do this MIB service, but I want this service to include my leasing that equipment. All right, so you can, MIBS, you can do that either way. We see this traditionally used by small schools, small school districts, small library systems, where you have a very limited IT staff. All right, just know that it is an option. I see more libraries doing the option of, we already own the equipment, or we're going to buy the equipment outright. We just want to contract with someone to do that management monitoring for us. Again, let me know if you have questions there. I know it's a lot of information. Now, if you are applying for Category 2, the internal connections, it's really important that when you receive the equipment that you label it, basically to indicate that this is a component that E-rate covered, right? Whether it's a switch and access points, a UPS, a firewall, whatever. Make sure that, when you're labeling it, that it is labeled that this was, covered by E-rate, make, model, the date it was installed. Keep track of that in your inventory. Now, as far as transfers, this was a change several years ago where with Category 2, let's say you when you file the Form 471, maybe you're asking for 30 access points, and you're going, your intent when you're applying for this is maybe you have 3 branches, and your intent is to put 10 new APs in each of your 3 branches. Well, maybe once you get the equipment, maybe you realize, well, no, we really only need 8 at this branch, but we need 12 at the second branch. Okay, E-rate rules allow us now to transfer that equipment. You don't have to report this to USAC. You just keep track of it in your inventory system. So if you were to get audited, you could, you could easily show, okay, instead of 10 in branch A, we put 8 there and then 12 over in branch B. Okay, just keep track of that. But again, you can transfer that equipment, from one library branch to another without issue. Now, the E-rate rules do require that if you ask E-rate to cover the equipment cost, that you have to show that, equipment's being used for 5 years. Now, if it's, let's say, an AP fails or a switch fails, right, just document it. If you're not going to replace it, document that this is why we can't show, 5 years worth of usage, right? The equipment failed. Just document that. All right. After 5 years, all right, if E-rate, covered the cost, after 5 years, it's yours, right? You can dispose of it, you can transfer it, you can give it away, right? Again, at that point, USAC, the FCC doesn't care what you do with it, right? No need to notify USAC. Now, I've already mentioned about NIFs not being eligible for funding. If it's equipment being used solely for that non-instructional facility, that, data center, that admin building, unless it's going to be shared equipment and you can show that, the traffic from a branch, is actually going through that admin building, all right? Again, it's not equipment being used like an access point being purchased to be used solely for that NIF location. Okay, that's a lot of information. So again, please let me know if you do have questions. Let's jump in and talk about updates and what's new for 2026. Here's the biggie for our libraries. Last summer, the FCC Commission at the time, many of you are aware, voted to make hotspots for patrons, for our library patrons, for our schools, to send home with students, made those eligible under E-rate. And we had a lot of our libraries applying for that, right? With the FCC Commission is presidentially appointed. So with the change in the administration, the current administration said, previous administration didn't have the authority to make this eligible. There was some language in the Telecommunication Act around E-rate that says E-rate is to fund on premise. So that's the basis of the decision. So E-rate covering, off premise use. That this is, again, not trying to get political. This is the reasoning behind the decision. So effective September 30th. This past, well, basically a week ago, the FCC overturned that previous, adoption of the hotspots. Okay, so based on the decision, if you did apply for 2025, no one has received any review questions or funding letters. Everything's been on a hold, right? Awaiting a decision. All right. So if you did apply for the patron hotspots for 2025, those funding requests will be canceled. All right. This also applies, for 2026 moving forward. The reason I'm stressing that is if you went in today to file one of the Form 470s, the hotspots, the off-premise hotspots, as well as bus Wi-Fi. So that was another piece of this. They also made bus Wi-Fi, actually 2 years ago, made that eligible. So we have schools, that went into contract 2 years ago because it was then eligible. That has also been rescinded. Okay, so but again, moving forward. But like I said, if you go in today, we don't know how long it's going to take, for USAC, or the FCC to go in and make changes to the form. But if you went to file that bidding form today, you're still going to see those off-premise hotspots and bus Wi-Fi listed. All right, and I don't think there's anything that would keep you from putting it on a form, but you're not going to get it funded. Bottom line. Now, again, I've already mentioned this, but I want to stress it. This does not apply to hotspots for bookmobiles or the kiosks, all right? Because a bookmobile or a kiosk is considered on premise, right? That bookmobile is conducting library business. So those are still eligible. So any existing funding requests, as I said, in the system, those will be denied in the future. We don't know for sure when that's going to happen, more than likely pretty soon. All right. So again, the timing, the manner to be determined, but start preparing for that now. Really important, go back and reread your contracts, right, to see how the vendor addressed termination. All right, go back and check those contracts. All right. Now, a lot of our libraries, Oakland filed a 470, to ask for, what was it? Christine, remind me, like 40,000, some very large number of hotspots. All right.
It was a wildly it was like 50,000 maybe based on basically we took a look at the libraries, what the libraries had asked for under the emergency connectivity fund, and we extrapolated out, and and we had a number of libraries that said that they were going to do that and went ahead and filed a 471. And Lori's got it here. If you were part of that, hopefully, so we filed the 470, but the actual contract and the request for funding went to the library. So if your library requested funds for those, you should have had in your contract something along this line. Some vendors did not do that, so watch out. And if whatever your case is, that last bullet point is super important. Reaching out to your vendor now to see what is possible to do if you need to make changes. And I popped something into the chat too. This this is kind of still to be continued. This is where things are now. This is an interesting time in E-rate in that there there's always opportunity. Let's put it that way. There's always opportunity for things to change. And anyway, so ALA would like to know about what's going on with your library so that as they have conversations with Congress folks about what the FCC did, then, they have the details about what's going on and for different people's constituencies. And ALA really did use a lot of Ohio stories in their advocacy efforts. So you're important, and please, keep letting us know what's going on, and communication is really key. So those are my 2 cents, Lori.
Christine, yeah, because we're going to keep fighting the fight. In Yes, because, the ones of us that moved forward in good faith because we were told that, yes, this is eligible, and then have the rug pulled out from under us. All right. So again, at this point, it is what it is. But again, we're going to keep, as I said, fighting the fight. So, on the 470 that Oakland filed, there was language there, that said, if this program is not continued, if it's terminated, being able to get out of that service. Now, I know a lot of libraries, they were waiting on a funding decision before moving forward with the contract. All right. But again, get back with your provider. Now, I have heard from a handful of libraries where they were being pushed, and I'm not going to give service provider names, but a service provider that was pushing that the library sign a rider, right? That basically it would give them a new contract term. And I had a library send me a copy of the rider, the said rider, so I could read through it. And there was language in that rider that said that, signing this rider, you're agreeing to continue with the service, whether E-rate funds this or not. So it's very important. And the one library who sent me that, they decided that, yep, this is being well used by our patrons. We want to move forward, and continue offering this, and we're just paying fully out of pocket. So if you're planning on offering this service anyway, there's no issue by, signing off on a rider like that. But obviously, if E-rate not funding this, that you can't, this is something you can't afford, right? You're not going to sign that right, or just read the language very carefully. Like I said, it was when I saw that, and it's, well, wait, no, wait a minute here. It says right here, if you sign this, you're saying you're waiving that, and you're going to move forward with with the service regardless of what happens with the E-rate. All right, read it carefully. I got a little testy with it. I'll just put it that way. All right. So let us know, Christine or myself, if you have questions there. So let's talk about the Cat 2 budget. So just so if you're already SEPA compliant, what you have available, what is available, if you're not currently SEPA compliant, that you may make decisions, to change that and utilize the Cat 2 funding, because it's a wonderful resource. So 2026, I think I mentioned this is going to start, that will be starting a new 5-year, budget cycle. So if the 21 to 25, if you didn't use those funds, maybe you used some of it, you didn't, zero it out, or you didn't use all of it, I should say, the system's going to zero out. All right. So any 21 to 25 Cat 2 budget funds, if you didn't use, any or all of it, it's going to get zeroed out. And then starting with the 2026 funding year, you'll get a new 5-year, budget cycle. All right. Now, there are some tools out on USAC's website. They have not been updated yet. So if you go out and look at the current budget tool, it's going to have the 21 to 25 information. USAC is working on getting that updated. Now, when we look at the budgets, so if, let's say, you're a library system with 4 branches, or maybe it's main and 3 branches, you put in the square footage for each of those sites, right? Main plus the 3 branches in my example, and then the system just adds all of that square footage up. And then it takes that combined total of square footage and it multiplies by basically per square foot. And we'll talk about what those numbers are. But as I mentioned, you do have to be SEPA compliant. You do not have to be compliant at the point of filing the 470. Even at the 471, there is an option once you receive a funding letter where you can indicate that you're working at becoming SEPA compliant, because sometimes it may take a little while. All right. And, just because you put this on just because you put, a bidding request on a 470, say for equipment, I call it a wish list, right? The 470, it's the bidding form, but it really is a wish list. There is no requirement that you move forward and make a purchasing decision. All right. So, it may benefit you if powers to be, if you're looking at, do we become SEPA compliant? Do we not? You could go ahead and file that bidding form. You don't have to be SEPA compliant, like I said, at that point. All right. So again, just making that perfectly clear. So this is what the budget numbers look like. All right. So I am comparing here to look at, here are the values for what we had for the 21 to 25 funding year, or 5-year cycle compared to the new cycle. So where the libraries qualified at $4.50 per square foot, right? The combined square footage, it's now gone up to $5.43. So that's pretty huge. All right. Now, if we have, let's say in your library system, maybe you have some small library branch sites. Basically, if you do the math, right? If it's a library branch that has less than 5,558 square feet, right, you get what's called a funding floor. Okay. So again, if it's, we look at $5.43, you may have a couple of, smaller libraries, including a bookmobile, right, where it would qualify you maybe for those sites at the $30,175. All right. So it can, again, raise your budget. All right. Schools, we won't talk about that. All right. Again, theirs is based on per student. All right, so calculating your options, for libraries, like I said, it just adds up all the square footage. But again, whether it's a school district or a library system where you have, 10 library sites or less, All right, so we can look at the square footage. We can see that the first 3 branch locations, there's Main, East, and North. Their square footage is above that funding that funding minimum, right? So it's calculated, and I apologize, it's based on the $5 and whatever. I need to update my slide. I apologize. All right, it'll show you the numbers there. All right, but we can see that the West Branch, and we have a bookmobile, right, falls below that 5,558 square feet. All right, so we get the benefit of the 30,175 to basically add up our budget. Okay, very important, like I said, if you're going to apply for this, that you go into the E-rate portal and plug in that square footage, right, to make sure that your budget's being calculated correctly. All right, so during this, we have what we call the admin window. This is a period of time where we can go in, the fields are opened up where we can make, we can make corrections, we can provide information. It does open on October 15th. For the schools, it's a much busier time than the libraries, because schools have to go in every year and update their student enrollment and their lunch information. All right, for libraries, a little bit easier, because most of your information remains static. All right, but again, you can go in, update that that square footage. So if you go in and you change the square footage information, the system's going to look at that. What's the combined square footage? And it's going to add all of that together, multiply it by the $5 and whatever per square foot. I'm still working on memorizing these new numbers, right? It's going to say, okay, here's your budget, your forecast, right? Because none of the information has been validated yet. Right. So once you certify a 471, all right, then it's going to say, okay, this is preliminary. It's sitting out there waiting for USAC to verify the information. Once they do that, then once it is confirmed, then it'll show it as a confirmed budget amount. All right. Now it's very typical. We've already seen it. We've had Cat 2 for a while. If you make changes to your square footage, if you already have square footage out there, but you've not applied for Cat 2, during the application review, the reviewer will say, okay, prove the square footage. All right. And there's a number of ways to do that. I know, Don Yarman can write a validation letter. He'll pull some data, to validate that. I have also pointed the reviewers to the IMLS site. They see that as, yes, this is a confirmed information. I can say, here's the URL. So each of your branches, for each site, it'll show the square footage there. All right, so the reviewers may be happy with that. All right, but again, it is something where they're going to ask, for some kind of confirmation. Christine, was there something you wanted to add there?
No, I was just going to say, basically, they're looking for third-party sort of documentation. And sometimes with new builds, new builds is a separate process, but sometimes if you have auditor records or whatever, yes. So whatever records you can find to verify it, but barring that, don't hesitate to reach out to Oakland. We do those verifications all the time.
And thank you. So it's one of those requirements. You get the they call it a third-party validation. I do third-party validations for schools with student enrollment and the lunch information. I do a lot of those. But Dawn or Christine handles a lot of the validations for the library sites. All right. But again, they're going to want that third party, showing that. If it is, let's say it's new construction, it could be, I had a library that I helped with this year where they wanted information. It was even just an email from the construction company, the construction manager, that says, yes, this is when this building's going to open and here's the square footage. All right. So number of different pieces of information that they'll accept, but they want that third party. Now, I do want to point out here, when we talk about these budgets, right, you take the square footage, you multiply it, you get your budget. Just be aware, because this has caused a lot of confusion since we started receiving Cat 2. Let's say your budget comes out to $204,475. All right. If that's your budget, we call that a pre-discount budget. All right. So if you went out over that 5-year period, you're not required to spend it all in 1 year. You could do 1/5 each year. You could do half in 26 and maybe in 28 do the other half. Right. That's entirely up to you. All right. But if you were to spend up to that $204,475, E-rate's going to cover whatever your discount percentage is. Bottom line, you're never going to receive $204,475 from E-rate. All right. It's if you were to spend this much for the equipment, E-rate will cover up to that amount times your discount rate. All right. So again, it's been a little confusing for folks. So just want to stress that. All right. Any questions there at all? Okay. I want to make sure you have ample opportunity to ask. So I've already talked, about some of these forms, the admin window, things like that, just to make sure you understand here's the process, right? And an E-rate form for about everything. All right. So this time of year, I've also given you some suggested timelines. All right. It's not, locked in that this is the time frame, but this is kind of the recommended time frame. All right. So we always start out step one, assessing our needs, right? Creating our plan. So go back, are you going to apply for category 2? And if so, well, what do you need? Do you need some, some new access points? Maybe you don't have enough coverage right now. Maybe the access points that you have are failing, right? So go back and look at, what those needs are. Go back and look at if you have a contract for your bandwidth for your branches. All right. When does that contract expire? And if it's set to expire this coming June 30th, right, the new funding year starts July 1, the day after. So do you need to go out to bid, right, because that contract's coming up for renewal, right? So again, create your plan. I mentioned the admin window will open on October 15th. So that's that time frame where you can go in and you can update the square footage, all right, correct addresses. Okay, so those fields will be open. If you went in today and plugged in your square footage on October, well, actually probably on the 14th, that's all going to get changed, right? Reset to what it was originally. It doesn't formally open until October 15th. And then it's set to close. We don't have the actual date yet. It's tied to some of the other forms, all right? But usually closes early, mid-January, all right? The FCC will be announcing those dates. All right, but again, that's that admin window. So the bidding form, as I said, contract coming up for renewal, anything under category 2 that you want to ask for, you can start that now. It lists January. The bidding form, the 470s deadline is typically the 3rd week in February. You don't want to wait that late, right? You want to make sure when we file that bidding form, I'm getting ahead of my slides here, but when you file that bidding form, you have to leave it open for a minimum of 28 days to give vendors time to, maybe ask questions, to pull a bid together, get that to you. So the earliest you can start evaluating bids is on that 29th day. All right. But you want to make sure, do you have time to do the bid evaluation? Well, what if it's a service that requires board approval? All right. You want to make sure that you have ample time to get all of that done. Right. So as I mentioned, we do that bid evaluation, depends on, whatever that 29th day, whenever you close that bidding. You could go longer if you want. You could go 45 days if you choose, right? You have to do the minimum 28. All right. So again, do the bid evaluation. If you get 2 or more bids, sign up on the contracts. Now, when we say contracts, if you're asking, say, for that equipment, maybe you get a quote from a hardware company, and again, it lists maybe some switches, some APs, whatever. That quote, we call it a contract, even though you're not locked into some kind of term, right? We still the portal still refers to that as a contract. So if it's simply that hardware quote, you can sign and date it. That just shows that you made the decision that, yep, here's the company, here's the quote that we've chosen. All right. So again, we get all of that done, right? Then it usually opens about mid-January, closes about the 3rd week toward the end of March for the Form 471. Now, I mentioned that, with 470, there are some bidding exemptions. There's also, let's say you already have a contract for the circuits down to your branches and it doesn't expire, let's say until June 30th of 2028, right? You're still under contract. So if it's for a service you're already contracted for and it will go at least through June 30th, 2027, you don't have to file that bidding form. The 470, that's the only form we get some, pass on filing, right? Some relief from filing. All the other forms have to be filed every year, even if you're in the middle of a multi-year contract. All right, I want to stress that. All right, so the 471, this is where you're stating specifically, here's the service type we're asking for, here's the cost, here's the company information, all of that detail. Here's the date that the contract was awarded, here's the time frame that this contract is going to cover, right? All of that, really detailed, nitty-gritty information. All right, but again, typically opens about mid-January, closes, about the third week of March. We're waiting on the FCC to announce those dates. All 471s, right? Even if it is, if it's year 3 of that, say a 5-year contract, it's still going to go through review. All right. And so you may get, questions from a reviewer, right? Like I said, even if you're in the middle of the contract, we tend to get lots of questions. Let's say you're asking for, 2 hotspots, at $40 per month for the bookmobile and the kiosk. We get lots of questions about those, even though it's a small funding request. Typically, very easy answers, or easy questions, to provide an answer, but you still get those review questions. Now, typically that review process, March to August, what we saw this past funding year, because USAC was trying to get the funding letters out as quick as possible. There were some issues later in the summer where things started slowing down a lot. Just a heads up, if you've not received a funding letter yet for the 2025 funding year, all right. We did have some issues. We're still having some issues. All right. But it is typical. Let's say you submit that 471 on February 1st. This past year, we saw like within maybe, a couple of hours to a couple of days, getting review questions fairly quick after we submitted the 471. But it typically goes about March to August. The next step then is receiving a funding letter. Typically, the funding letters start going out about mid-April. There's no rhyme or reason. It's not necessarily first in, first out, right? So sometimes there's no rhyme or reason as to when you might receive the funding letter, all right? But April to August is typical. Once you receive the funding letter, then the next form in the process is this Form 486. It does 2 things. Because again, we're doing this months in advance, right? We're filing this 471 months in advance of the funding year. So the 471, you're indicating that, yes, the service has started, and are you SEPA compliant or not? All right. So again, that's the purpose there. And we'll talk about the deadlines for those. We receive the service, we pay the vendor, right? And then there's one of 2 ways to receive the funding. And like I said, some of these steps I'll get a little deeper in here in a minute. But with the invoicing, there's one of 2 ways to receive the E-rate funding. One way is that you pay the invoice in full. Let's say that monthly, bandwidth cost is $500 per month. All right, so $6,000 for the year. You pay that in full, right? After you pay, you may be invoiced monthly, but you pay all 12 months. Then you can file the bear form to say, okay, I paid, X amount. I paid my $6,000. USAC now send me my reimbursement. Okay, that's one of the options. The other option is you communicate with your service provider and you tell them that you want a discounted bill. So if your discount rate is 80%, they would invoice you for 20%. And then it falls on the service provider to file an E-rate form. In this case, it's called a SPI, a service provider invoice. But the service provider files that form to say, okay, I billed, the applicant, their 20%, whatever that rate is, send me back the balance. All right. So again, each one of those forms have, very distinct deadlines. All right. And I think I mentioned, with E-rate, it's typical to be dealing with up to 3 funding years at any given time. Don't panic over that. It is certainly doable. right? You just keep, you juggle a little bit. All right, but it is doable. All right. So I mentioned, here we are in the middle of the 2025 funding year, getting ready to apply for the 2026 funding year. All right. But if we go, let's go back a year. All right. So the 2024 funding year, it ended June 30th, 2025. So, did you get discounted bills or not? If not, have you filed the paperwork to get the reimbursement? All right. So the reimbursement, I'll go ahead and fill you in here. The reimbursement deadline, it's 120 days from the last date to receive service. So 120 days from June 30th, 2025 makes that October 28th, 2025. All right. So again, I'll show you some places you can go to see, has everything been dispersed, but keep that deadline in mind. Now, I tend to get ahead of my slides, but if you have not filed the BEAR yet, if you've not received the reimbursement, maybe you filed it, but for whatever reason it's being held up, right? We can ask for a one-time extension. It's very easy to do. You do it within the Epic portal, but it will automatically give you a 120-day extension. All right. So it changes your deadline from October 28th, 2025 to February 25th. Gives you 4 more months. All right. So February 25th, 2026 gives you 4 more months to get that done. It's kind of like asking for an extension on your taxes, though. You have to ask for the extension by that October 28th deadline. All right. So, like I said, a little bit of a juggling act. So the next, for our current funding year, 2025, let's say you received your funding letter. That next form, the 486, we have, this one's kind of crazy, we have 120 days from the start of service or the start of the funding letter, whichever is the later date. All right. A lot of the funding letters went out between mid-April and June 30th. All right. A very large percentage. So regardless of your date, all right, if it's prior to July 1st, your 120-day countdown that didn't start until July 1st. All right. So if you received a funding letter, on or before July 1st, the 486 deadline for our current 2025 funding year would be October 29th. Now, with the 486, I will give you a heads up here. This is the only form where this will happen. USAC will send you an email saying, hey, you've missed that 486 deadline. They give you 10 more days to get it filed, right? But then without any impact. If you totally ignore that and you really wait to file it, then they can change the service start date. So let's say you missed the deadline by 2 months, then they can change your service start date to when you actually filed the form. So you wind up, losing several months worth of service. All right. So this is it's the easiest of all the forms to file. We've asked the FCC to do away with it. They haven't agreed to that yet. So I'll show you where you can look to see, do you still need to file that? All right. So again, now we're getting ready to file for 26. So that little bit of a juggling there. All right. I've already talked about these 12 steps. I'm not going to belabor that more because now we're going to look at it in this view. All right. So again, a lot of this I've already covered. Like I said, I get ahead of my slides. So again, very important, go back, assess the needs, look at your contracts. Are they coming up for renewal? It could also be maybe you're currently under contract. It depends on the contract that you're under. Maybe you need to increase your bandwidth. All right. Does your contract allow you to increase the bandwidth during the term of the contract? Some providers allow it, not all. All right. So go back and look at, can you, increase bandwidth if that's needed in the current terms of the contract? Go back, assess the needs, make that plan. Are you going to, do you think you might apply for Cat 2? All right. Start coming up with that list. What do you need? All right, we've already talked about the entity profiles. Again, for libraries, very important, put in that square footage. All right, if you see that there's a building missing, maybe you have a new library that will be coming up during this upcoming funding year, reach out to USAC. Okay, there's the help desk number. All right, they can assist you with getting that entity number. All right, posting that 470. Like I said, anything new, contracts coming up for renewal, if it's something that you don't meet that exemption, like the CABIO, all right, start looking at that, getting prepared to file the 470. Now, if you are going to need to file a 470, I will be doing separate 470 training to kind of walk you through the form itself. When you look at it, it's not that complicated, but there's some things that, some bidding requirements that you might want to put on the form. We'll talk about best practices, things that, we've experienced over the last, number of years. You might want to do this, if you're asking for this type of service. So if you are planning on filing a 470, be it Cat 1 or Cat 2, please plan on attending the 470 training. I am doing separate training. I'll do a Category 1 470 training date, and then a separate for Category 2. All right. So again, just a heads up there. All right, but go back. Like I said, check the services, anything new, contract expiration dates. Do you need to file the 470? All right. So again, month-to-month service, the hotspots for the bookmobile, the kiosk, oftentimes those are not under a contract, like for a contract period of time. Maybe when you initially purchase those hotspots, maybe initially it was for 24 months. And then after that, it's just, month to month, right? Until you contact the vendor or the service provider to say, I don't want this service anymore. When it is that month to month service, you have to file a 470 every single year because you're not locked into a contract. All right, 470 has to be filed. But remember, that exemption, like the CABIO. All right, if you're again applying for that, new service, contract renewal, bandwidth upgrades. All right, look at that. Now, I don't see this as much on the library side as I do on the school side, but some contracts may have language in it that says, this initial contract term, let's say it's, 60 months, it's a 5-year contract. At the end of that initial term, we will give you the option to extend it. Some language will say, 2 1-year extensions. So you're coming up at the end of that contract. If you're happy with the service, you're happy, with the provider, you could basically choose to say, okay, we're going to extend this another year. All right. And if your contract allows for this, it has to be clearly stated in the contract. Right. It's not something the vendor can come back, after the fact and say, oh, no, we're going to allow this. It has to be, language in the original contract. All right. But you could, use that. We call it a voluntary extension. You could extend it another year and you don't have to go out to bid. All right. But again, it has to clearly state that. Some contracts, just a heads up here, some contracts will say, okay, the initial term is, let's say, 36 months. All right. And at the end of that, your service will it's just perpetual. It's just going to continue until you tell us we don't want the service anymore. All right. That does not count as a voluntary extension. USAC refers to that as an evergreen contract, right? So voluntary extensions have to have a hard, expiration, at some point in the future. Evergreens, again, it's just perpetual. It just renews every year. All right. So if it's, that type language, then you have to plan on filing a new 470. All right. And again, if you have that voluntary extension option, all right, verify it's in the contract. I can't say that enough. All right. And then you put something in writing. All right. Notify the vendor that you want to use the extension. You could put something, say in a Word doc, on letterhead saying, yep, our contract allows for this. I'm going to extend it. It's now going to extend, to June 30th, 2027. All right. But you have to memorialize that. All right, so 470. All right, I've already, again, ahead of my slides, I've covered a lot of this. 470 is available now. Again, I strongly encourage you to attend the 470 training. It has to be out there a minimum of 28 days. All right, once we know the deadline, I'll be letting you know that. Okay, that'll be published. So the way this works, though, let's say the FCC says, okay, the 471 deadline is going to be March 25th, 2026. We count back 29 days. That gives us the 470 deadline. That will allow you to, go out to bid for 28 days on the 29th day, which is also the 471 deadline. You would basically evaluating the bid, signing the contract, file the 471. But like I said, we don't know the 470 deadline till we know the 471. All right. So just a few questions here that we typically get. When does the waiting period start? The way this works, it's based on the date you hit submit when you file the 470. The system does not look at the time. Did you submit this at 9 a.m. or was it 9 p.m.? Right? That first day the day you submitted, that starts the waiting period. All right. And I know this because I just had a conversation with a vendor saying, oh, I don't think they waited their full 28 days. All right. Bottom line, when you file a 470, after you submit it, the form will say, here is your allowable contract date. It's the 29th day that the system calculated, and that's the earliest date that you could evaluate bids and signing a contract. You go by the date that is going to show up on that 470. To count, it's basically calendar days. All right. So again, weekends, right? Again, 28 calendar days, right? I mentioned the earliest you can select a vendor is on that 29th day. Okay. So I think we've covered all of that. This is a really nice slide that USAC shared at their training. So again, just look at the calendar, right? Now USAC has they've made this statement the last several years in training that how important it is to put a deadline on the 470. We know that the 29th day, that's the earliest, that we can accept or that we can start evaluating. But it's important to state that, all right? Because what happens is, let's say you get to the 29th day. Well, somebody that, that has to be involved with the bid evaluation, maybe they're out of the office for the next week, all right? So the bid evaluation gets delayed. If you did not say on that 470, here's the deadline to submit bids, then any bids that come in during that period when you're waiting for the staff member to come back, you would have to include all of those bids in the bid evaluation as well. All right. So again, USAC has said, if you you want this because maybe you're trying to get things in for a board meeting. Okay. Very important that you put that that deadline on the 470. We'll look at that in very detailed description when we do the 470 training. Now, when we file the 470, there is basically like a drop down where we can say, okay, here's the type service we're looking for, and it adds all of that on the form. There's also a narrative box where you can give a description. Well, sometimes, maybe you need to attach a document, to make this really clear what you're looking for. All right. Maybe you have, 6 branches and you want different bandwidth increments, for those branches. You want to, make it clear that maybe you're going with point-to-point circuits. So, here's our, basically the Oakland circuit comes into, our main library, at this street address. And we're seeking bids for point-to-point circuits to our 6, library branches. You could have just a simple spreadsheet that says, here is that DMARC address, our main library's address. Here are the names and the street addresses for each of those branches. All right. So my point to all of that is, you could have this additional document that you could upload, attach to the 470 to give vendors more information. And it's a lot easier to do that versus trying to write all this out in that text box in the narrative. All right. Just know that any document that you upload in the portal calls it an RFP, a request for proposal. All right. Again, it could just be a simple spreadsheet or Word document. It could be a formal RFP if you're in a construction project, right? And, where you're looking at, lots of different technologies. Okay, so again, it could also be that very formal RFP document, as I mentioned. All right, so during the bidding period, again, be mindful of those deadlines. Vendors may reach out to you to ask, clarifying questions. And if they ask you a specific question about a service, you need to give them that information. You can't not, you can't just blow them off, right? And never ever, you may know it in your head that I really don't want to change vendors, but don't tell a competitor that no, we already know who we're going with. Do not do that. All right. I've seen it happen. It's not good. All right, so the evaluation. So again, if you have two or more bids, you do the evaluation. The E-rate rule here is a long-standing E-rate rule that price has to be the highest weighted factor, right? But E-rate does not require that you go with the lowest bid. So again, price has to have the highest number of points assigned to it, but you can look at other things like your previous experience with the vendor. Is it a local vendor, local or regional vendor, right? If you're asking for equipment, is it compatible with my existing equipment? Right. So again, you can look at other things, but as long as price has the highest number of points. Now, it's really important that you retain all this documentation. There's a document retention rule that you keep documentation for 10 years. And question here real quick. So the question here, is there a limit to one bidding process at a time? It is not. All right. I've actually had this happen where, we filed a bidding form for some equipment and that's out there. Maybe we're 10 days in. And then we realized, oh, we're going to, we asked for APs and some, Ethernet drops. We're going to have to replace our switches as well. You could file a second 470 and you can have two different, bidding processes out there at the same time. All right. I hope that helps. Let me know if you need more information. And please, yeah, don't hesitate to ask, to reach out with more questions. All right. But yes, I mean, it's up to you as far as like the number of the 470s that you filed. You can have multiple. That's entirely up to you. Okay. Just keep in mind that with each 470 that you file, each one's going to have, that bidding deadline. All right. The other thing is, and again, it's all definitely allowed, but if you have two different 470s, that means you have to have, maybe even if you're going with the same company. All right. Let's say you choose the same hardware vendor, but because there were two different bidding, you've got two different bidding documents out there. That means that you would have to create two different funding requests when you go to file the 471, because each one's going to point to a different bidding form, a different 470. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions on that. All right. But very important, right, that you keep a copy of this bid matrix. Should you get audited, the winning and losing bids. So again, not just the winning, but the losing as well. Right. You keep all of that, that documentation. Now, when we do the 470 training, we're going to talk about some best practices. I mentioned that, some things that we've seen over the years, right? Some things that have caused some issues. Like one of the things, let's say you're looking at new equipment. Let's say you're looking at structured cabling. You can require a walkthrough, right? So, have vendors, you say, I'm going to do a walkthrough. Here's the date that's going to happen. You can make that a bidding requirement. You can say, the walkthrough is required. Any vendor submitting a bid that did not conduct a walkthrough, you're going to be disqualified. So the E-rate rules say, something that's going to get a vendor disqualified, they need to know that up front, right? But you've already told them up front. So if a vendor decides, I'm going to send them a bid anyway, that's on them, right? If they don't meet that bidding requirement, you already told them this is going to get you disqualified. So you've done your part. But like I said, we're going to cover a lot of that in detail when we do the 470 training. Okay, so again, ahead of my slide, the disqualifying a bid, again, just stated on the form. There's lots of different things that you could put on there, like I said. All right, just list those. And when we talk about disqualifying factors, it's a simple yes, no. Did they meet it? Did they not? Did they comply or did they not? Now, what if you're going through this, you're waiting and you've not received any bids? All right, it's perfectly fine for you to reach out to vendors that you currently work with. Let them know, I've got a 470 out there. Would you please respond? All right, that is not a problem. All right, reach out to those existing providers. Now, maybe this is a kind of a snarky comment, but for new services procurement, solicit bids from willing vendors. Don't limit it, say to that brother-in-law, family member. All right, you want to reach out to, like I said, vendors that you typically work with. All right, making sure the price is cost effective. All right, check some, because sometimes maybe you reach out to that single vendor to say, hey, could you respond? There's no requirement that you contact, X number of vendors, right? So even if you get just that one bid, that's fine, right? If it's cost effective. Sometimes I'll go online and I'll check like other like marketplace options. I'll go to some known, hardware sites and just kind of compare those.
Hey, Lori, there's a question about basically about category 2 from
Thank you.
Berkshire Public Library.
Thank you. I didn't see that. Thank you. Hi, Robin. Okay, so Robin, so basically, is your library site, are you SEPA compliant? That's something that that Dawn sends out from Oakland. I could go back and look at that listing for the current funding year. Or Christine, do you have that information handy? But Robin, we can look that up.
I was just starting a direct message to Robin, and yeah, well, we can work with that. But I just generally SEPA compliant. If you're eligible for equipment, you need to be looking for equipment that is eligible too, right? Going back to that eligible services list idea that Lori was talking about earlier. So
Thank you.
if you've got something particular in mind, Robin, feel free to email us and we'll work through the details. Okay.
Yeah, but the good general answer, are you eligible? It really comes down to, are you SEPA compliant? And like I said, you should be getting something, from Oakland if you've not already. And Christine, Don, and I haven't had that conversation yet. Each year, information is sent out to the libraries that it's an LOA, basically a letter of agency saying, yes, I give you permission to put my library site on the Oakland forms. All right, but it's also a question: are you SEPA compliant or not? Because when we file for internet access, not just the what I call the raw circuit. If you're the internet access, you have to be SEPA compliant for that as well. So that's something that we really look at for the Oakland applications.
Yeah, and Don sent out the first kind of reminder message. I've got a reminder to myself to start bugging people in earnest. I think next week who have not responded to that. And so folks who are brand new here, Lori's given you a lot of information. If you only have one location, the things that you need to listen to most closely are this category 2 idea, because we take care of all of your category 1. If you do have more than one location, we take care of category 1 for a site, usually your main library, but sometimes it's different depending on the library. And again, letter of agency and this other, whether or not you're SEPA compliant applies to every single library, because we take care of one category 1 circuit to every library system. That's, yeah, very important. Thank you.
Thank you, because I had not mentioned that. All right, so signing contracts, right? We've gone through this bid evaluation, then you sign off. It could be something where, let's say that, you're welcome, Robin. Let's say that, you got a board meeting coming up, but maybe that's not until after the close of the 471 filing window. We are allowed to basically write a letter that says, as of this date, we've evaluated the bids. This is the vendor that we've chosen. And we attach that to the unsigned contract. You still have to move forward, and sign the contract and get that to your provider, to initiate that, that order, right, to start that service. But for E-rate purposes, we can use a letter where you've memorialized the vendor selection. And then, like I said, we attach that to the unsigned contract. So that way USAC, when they're doing the application review, they can see, what type service, what's the cost. All right. But again, that is allowed. But we have to have that signature, whether it's a letter or the actual signed, contract or hardware quote, before we file the 471. All right, important to know your role, right? So again, I don't see as many issues on the library side with this as I do the school side. But again, it's your job at representing the library. It's to, decide the needs, file the bidding form. Vendors cannot help you file that bidding form. Obviously, they can't help you with the bid evaluation. That may sound pretty silly, right? But again, they cannot do that piece. Now, once you file that 471, you've already chosen a vendor. So, during application review, especially if you're asking for equipment, the reviewer may come back and ask, some detailed information about, maybe a make and model of let's say a switch, okay, that you might need to reach out to the service provider for some detail. That's perfectly fine at that point because you've done your bid evaluation, you chose a vendor. All right. So again, that part's fine. All right. So again, I'm not going to get into this, just to give you a heads up. When we do 471 training, I call the 471 the Mac Daddy of all the forms. It's the most complicated to file. In about mid-January, early February, I'll do another round of training, specifically walk you through how to file a 471. All right. And before we actually jump into the 471, I'll walk you through how to upload, those signed, that letter, that signed contract, whatever that documentation that you have. All right. So again, 471 training. If you're new, you definitely want to plan on attending. Even if you've been filing for a while, it's like filing your taxes. You do this once a year, and sometimes the forms change a little bit. So it's a good idea to still attend the training just as a refresher. All right. So again, the contract module is just letting USAC know this is how you're purchasing the service, so they know what to go look for when they're reviewing your application. All right. I've already said this about 471. You file this every single year. Really important. All right. Now, if I mentioned with the 470, if you're applying for both category 1, again, say the circuits for your branches, it could be that hotspot for the bookmobile. But if you're applying for category 1 and you're asking for cat 2, the category 2, you could, if you wanted, you could put all of that on the same 470, on the same bidding form. That's your choice. All right. Or you could file multiples, again, your choice. When you go to file the 471, though, if you are applying for both category 1 and category 2, by definition, those have to go on separate 471 applications. All right. So again, just keep that piece in mind. But let's say you're applying for category 2, and maybe you had two different, the question earlier, I've got two different bidding processes. Maybe that's for equipment. So you've got two different 470s out there for category 2. Even if it's from the same company, that means you're going to have two different funding requests because you're pointing to two different bidding documents. All right. As long as it's all under the same category, if it's category 2, you could have multiple funding requests on the same 471 application. All right. Just again, saves a little bit of time doing that. What I typically recommend, if it's something where you think you're not quite sure, is this going to get funded? Is this going to get delayed somehow? Again, I see this more on the school side than I do the library side. Put it on its own 471 so it doesn't hold up, your other funding decisions. All right. So again, how many do you file? If you are filing cat 1, cat 2, then that means you have to have at least two 471s, right? You could file one 471, say for cat 2, go ahead and get that out there. And maybe you had another 470 you filed really late, it's right up on the deadline. You could file a separate 471 for that. Again, that's up to you there. Again, this review process, PIA, Program Integrity Assurance, pardon me. All right. I mean, the reviewers can come back and ask just about anything, right? So, we see this a lot. Hotspots, say for the bookmobile, they want a copy of, say, the bill, what's, a current bill. They're going to verify what's the cost, what's the type service, to make sure that, yes, this, $39.95 per month really is for, for a hotspot. All right. So again, they can look at that. We talked about if you change or you provide, new square footage information, they'll ask you, to verify that info. All right. So again, just a standard part of the, applying for E-rate. Now, they will send you an email. They'll send it to whoever is listed as the 471 contact, to say, hey, there's some review questions out in the portal. So when they send that out, they give you 15 days to respond. Now, within the portal, and when we do 471 training, I'll show you where it's located. But you can ask for basically one time an extension. They'll give you a 7-day extension. You do have the option to ask for, say, a second extension, but that requires a PIA manager approval. The first time you ask, the system automatically grants that. Now, the PIA reviewer, they will notify you if they plan on denying something or reducing a request. They can say, okay, we don't think this is eligible for this reason. Do you agree with this? And if you don't, provide us additional information as to why we should not deny or reduce the cost. All right. So you do get a chance to, this rebuttal. But they will let you know if they plan on denying or reducing something. So the happy day is getting the funding letter. All right. So I mentioned these typically start going out, at least in previous years, about mid-April. And then they release them typically once a week. So like basically each Thursday, we know to watch for funding letters, right? And they call it a wave. So wave 1 is the very first, batch of funding letters. So let's say the next week, the following Thursday, they release another batch. That's wave 2, and so on. All right. So they just keep releasing those waves. Now, as far as who receives this information, the account administrator will receive an email saying, okay, here's your funding letter. If the 471 contact is different, the 471 contact will also receive the email. And attached to the email, there'll be 2 documents. One is a spreadsheet. It's really hard to read this thing. So let's say you have 2 different funding requests on that 471 application. It'll be a spreadsheet that has 2 rows, 1 row per funding request with like 30, 40 columns. All right. But there's also a very pretty PDF that's attached. Go for the PDF document. Again, it's much easier to read. They'll explain, if something was reduced, here's the dollar amount that was approved. Much easier to decipher what's going on. Yeah, really important that as soon as possible, when that email is received with the funding letter, check it over. Because sometimes, I saw this happen this funding year, where when someone was filing, they put in an incorrect date. So instead of asking for 12 months of service, the date error, in essence, they only asked for 1 month worth of service. All right. During review, the reviewer didn't say, hey, you're only going to get 1 month, because as far as the reviewer was concerned, well, this is the date they put, right? So it wasn't found out until after the funding letter was received. Okay. So the reason I am stressing this is the date. Let's say that funding letter is issued on May 1st. All right. You have 60 days from the date that letter was issued to file an appeal. If something got reduced or denied, something you weren't expecting, then you can file an appeal, but you have 60 days. And we always start the appeal process first with USAC. All right. So it's typical if you file this on, let's say, the 90th day. It's sorry, you missed your opportunity. All right. We can always go back and, appeal with the FCC and try to make a case as to why that appeal deadline was missed. But historically, it takes a lot to get these approved. It has to be based on some horrific, issue. All right. That caused you to miss it. All right. So again, check it over. And I stress this every year because I hate when this happens. All right, I've mentioned about this 486, right? So indicating service has started, that whether you're SEPA compliant or not. Go back and look, for the current 25 funding year. Are there 486s that still need to be filed? But you will get that email if you don't file it by that, if your deadline, let's say your deadline is October 29th. All right. You'll get an email letting you know that you need to get in there and get that filed. I think we've already thoroughly covered this as far as the equipment, that 18-month window there versus the 12-month for the recurring service. All right, document retention, I mentioned, and I like this is not my bright idea. The FCC changed this several years ago where we now have a 10-year document retention, and it's 10 years from the last date to receive service. All right, so again, be mindful of that. All right, so we're getting down to the end here. All right, so paying for the equipment, finishing out our 12 steps here. So I mentioned that it's one of two ways. You pay the invoice in full. You file what's called the bear form or the form 472 to say, yes, I need my reimbursement. Send me the funds. All right. The other is if you get those discounted bills. Now, really important, if you want discounted bills, really important that you communicate with the service provider. All right, let them know up front that, yes, you want these discounted bills. All right, and you always have to show that you paid your non-discount portion.
Hey, Lori?
Yes.
I've got a point that kind of goes back a couple slides. I'm sorry, I was busy in the chat. So back to step 9, the 486.
Yes.
So for folks who have branches,
yes,
who are filing category 1 for their branches, they don't necessarily have to be SEPA compliant because
you're right.
That is just the circuit. It is not the data, right?
That is correct.
Oakland
I apologize. I didn't cover that.
So you may find the first part is informs USAC when the libraries will start or have started. And if you're on a multi-year contract again, they've started, you're good. But I have seen libraries that have forgotten to do this step and lost their money. So if you have any questions about this, please reach out. Okay, end of commercial.
Thank you. Yes,
back to step 11. I'm sorry.
No, you were good. You were good. Yeah, and Christine, so if because Oakland is providing the internet, we're going to answer those questions about your SEPA compliance. All right. But if you're asking for just what I call the raw circuit, those point-to-point circuits down to your branches where there's no internet and, as part of that contracted service, you do not have to be SEPA compliant for that. It's only for if you're asking for commodity internet or anything under Cat 2. All right, so again, I have a step-by-step guide out on that resource page. If you need to file a 486, that guides you through, all right, how to answer those questions, all right, or reach out to either Christine or myself, and we can walk you through that. All right. Now, I do also want to point out, I talked about the deadline for that 486, that I mentioned that it's 120 days from the start of service or when you get your funding letter. So maybe it's service that actually started July 1st, but you're one of those, applicants that got caught up in these what USAC has been referring to as some black hole, applications that kind of fell through the cracks. So if, let's say, you didn't receive your funding letter until September 15th, then your 120-day countdown for the deadline starts September 15th. Right? Because again, it's the start of the service or the date of your funding letter, whichever is the later date. All right. Again, this one's complicated because it's a bit of a moving target for the deadline. All the other forms have, a fixed, a hard deadline with it. 486 is a moving target. And Christine, thank you for that note there. Yeah, I actually have like X's saying, do not check this box, whatever. Based on best practices, things that I've experienced personally, or I've seen from, both library and school applicants. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way there. All right. So paying for the equipment, asking for the reimbursement. So the bear form, again, that's where you've paid the bills in full. Deadline, again, go back, look at, say for the 2024, have you filed that form yet? One of the things I do, whether I think I'm going to really need that extension or not, I go ahead and ask for it. All right. There's no harm in doing that. Give yourself that buffer, that extra 120 days. I've run into this before where, let's say it was like October 15th before I could get that bear filed. Well, then USAC took a little while, maybe several weeks to process it. Well, maybe we're all human, right? We can make those human mistakes. So, maybe they come back and say, oh, you made a mistake, so we denied your bear. All right. Well, if that happens, if you ask for that extension, you still have that extra pocket of time to go in and refile. All right. So I've had some folks saying, "Oh no, I know I'm going to get that bear filed by that October 28th date. I don't need that extension." It only takes a minute to ask for the extension and add on the resource page. There's a step-by-step guide to do, to ask for the extension. Do yourself the favor, right? As a just in case. Because if it gets denied and you didn't get the extension, then you have to ask for, you have to file an appeal to ask for more time. It's a whole thing. All right. Just ask for the extension. All right. Just in case. Now, with the bear form, a couple of things to know here. Not specific on the bear form itself, but when you file the bear form, any reimbursements come, it's an ACH transfer. All right. So this actually started back in 2016, where when they changed how the money came to the applicants, how those reimbursements, how that money flowed. So starting in 2016, we had to fill out a banking form. All right. E-rate form for everything. This one is the form 498. For most of us, it was a one and done, right? We did not have to touch it again unless you change banks. And that does not happen, thankfully, very often. All right. So on that banking form, it does say, here's the bank we're using, here's our routing number, our account number. It'll also have contact information. All right. So definitely, most definitely, if you change banks, you need to update that 498 form. All right. You do not file a whole new form. You basically go in and modify the existing form. Do not file a new one. If you realize that you're in that situation, let me know and I can step you through that. All right. You modify an existing form. All right. One other thing to be aware of, and this one's been kind of a sticky wicket for some of us. On that 498, this was added just, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago during the pandemic. All right. If you applied for the Emergency Connectivity Fund or some of the other federal funds, we had to register, right? Our library systems, our school districts had to register at sam.gov, right? And when you do that, it also asked for banking information because that was basically money coming from the Treasury, right? Getting deposited down to the school libraries accounts. All right. So we had to register at sam.gov. When we did that, when a school or library did that, you were issued what was called a UEI, a unique entity identifier. All right. It's this long alphanumeric number, whatever. All right. The UEI or that SAM.gov registration, we have to go in and renew that annually. All right. That is not a one and done kind of thing. You have to go in each year and at least renew it. Say, yep, the information is still correct, right? In order to keep it current. All right. The reason I'm stressing this is currently, say technically, E-rate does not require a SAM.gov registration. That's what the program rules say, right? That we know what's coming down the road. We have no idea when, right? But as it stands right now, you're not required to register at SAM.gov, okay, according to program rules. However, if you have to modify that 498, this is the sticky wicket part, all right? If you have to make some modification on that form, and it could be just changing the contact, right? You're not changed banks, right? Nothing's changed there, but maybe you have a new fiscal officer and you want to put that contact info. Any changes on that form, USAC has added the UEI field to the form and they made it a required field. So while technically you're not required to be registered at sam.gov, you are, all right? It only if you have to modify that form. It's a hard stop when you get to that field. You go in and you change, the name, the contact info for your fiscal officer. Okay, all's right with the world. You get to that UEI field, and basically the system, the portal goes out and looks at the sam.gov site to see, do you have a UEI and is it current? And if the answer is no to either one of those, you cannot modify your form. All right, you would have to go to sam.gov, either register if you've not already, get that done. If you're registered but it expired, you have to renew it and then go back and modify the 498. I hate having to tell you this, but it's caused a lot of heartburn. All right, so but this is only if you're filing the bare form. If you only do discounted bills, then the service provider they're on the hook for keeping up the UEI, right? If you're doing discounted bills, money's not coming directly to you. All right. Again, hate having to explain that, but it is what it is. Just be prepared for that. Go in and check your UEI. If you're registered at sam.gov, go in and make sure that it is renewed. All right, that it is current. All right, so the SPY method, again, this is where the vendor's giving you, or the service provider's giving you discounted bills, and then it's on the vendor's responsibility to file for the reimbursement. One other thing I want to point out, because in fact, I got a call from someone this morning. Another piece here, service providers, if they are participating in the E-rate program, service providers have to fill out E-rate forms, as well. Initially, they have to fill out something to get a service provider identification number. All right, E-rate form for everything. All right, service providers each year have to file an annual certification. It's called a SPAC, Service Provider Annual Certification. I've had some vendors argue that, oh no, I don't have to do this every year. It's called annual certification for a reason, okay? You do this every year. Again, the point of this is you may go to file a bare form. So again, the call I received this morning, applicant, it was a school district, went to file the bare. It's, well, I don't see any of my funding requests. They were all approved and I filed my 486. So we started digging. The vendor that they had chosen for 2025, our current funding year, had not filed the annual certification yet for the 2025 year. All right. So service providers have to do the annual certification. That has to be approved before you can file for reimbursement. So if you run into that, you go to file for the reimbursement and a funding request that should be there, it's not showing up, that's more than likely the reason. Reach out to me, please let me know that. I can look up that information to see, did they file it or not? I can reach out to the vendor on your behalf if you'd like, all right, to explain to them what needs to be done. Again, sorry, I know it's a lot of information. This is a site, and I'm gonna spend just a couple of minutes showing you this. This is a site, it's not out on the, in the E-rate portal, but it's data that's pulled from the portal. E-rate Central is a national consulting company, but they make this available, and it's a wonderful site. They do not ask for any contact information, okay? So it's a good, quick place to determine, is there something I need to do? All of this information you can retrieve from the E-rate portal, but you can only look at one funding year at a time. What I like about the site is it shows you your history all the way back to 1998, all right? So, but it's a wonderful site. The hardest part about using it is you need to know your build entity number. That's the hardest part. All right. Again, Christine or I can look that up if you don't know that number, if you've not memorized that yet. All right. But if you go to e-ratecentral.com under funding history, you'll see this gray box here. Put in your build entity number. All right. You click the little pointer. It's going to come back and say, okay, here's all your information. The very first column is the funding year. All right. So we can see here 2025. That funding year is a hyperlink, so you can drill down and look at more information, right? Get more granular. All right. But very quickly scanning across, it gives me a wealth of information right off the bat. So if I look at 2025, I can see that there were 5 funding requests, originally on the 471, but 4 of them were funded. All right, because maybe you put something on a 471 and then you changed your mind and said, no, I'm going to cancel that. All right, again, you can do that, depending on contract terms, whatever. All right, so we can see, as you're reading, if you can see my mouse moving here, you see where there's 4 funding requests, and all 4 of those funding requests were listed on a 486. So that tells me, okay, I've met the requirement for filing the 486 for this current funding year, because all 4 of my approved FRNs, funding request numbers, were reflected on a 486. Check, I got that done. All right, as we read across, it's going to say, here's the total amount of funding that was requested. Then it breaks it out to say, well, here's how much, was made up out of category 1. And if we applied for category 2, here's the amount for that. Right. And so as I read across, it's going to show me, here's the total amount that was committed. Maybe I asked for the 199,000. All right. But for whatever reason, well, in this case, something was canceled. Right. Here's the amount that was approved. Then it says, here's the amount that was dispersed. So maybe we applied for that internal connections license, right? A 5-year license subscription. We've already paid for that. So we went ahead and filed for the reimbursement. We don't have to wait until the end of the funding year. You can file for reimbursement once the equipment or service has been received. All right. We talk about multiple funding years, right? So if I come down and I look at 2024, all right, and I read across, okay, 5 funding requests, all 5 were funded. Really important, how much money was dispersed. If you look at 2024 and it's sitting at 0, you were funded, say, for $39,000, but 0's been dispersed, that means you need to file a bear form, right? And first ask for the extension, then file the bear form. Okay, so again, a lot of good information right here, all in one spot. Now, one other thing I want to show you here, not sorry for belaboring here, but if I click on 2025, all right, so, what does that look like? When was this funding letter issued? I don't remember seeing the funding letter. If I click on, in this case, let's say 2025, it'll show me here all of the funding requests. All right. If I click on the funding request number, that's the FRN, it's going to give me the detail, all the detail for that specific funding request. So a couple of things to look at. FCDL date. Here's the date that USAC issued that funding letter. All right. In this case, it was April 26, 2025. So if I go back and I look at that funding letter and I realize that I made a mistake, I wasn't fully funded, we know that we're well beyond that 60-day appeal period. So I know that if I want to fight this, I would have to file an appeal with the FCC, first off, to say, give me more time, to make my case. Right. It will also, if we see service start date, 486, if there's a date there, that means it's a funding that funding request was listed on a 486. All right, again, it's just a lot of good information. The other thing it's going to show, it will also show you, I'm sorry, give me a second. Sorry, somebody just came to my door. It will also show you the last date to invoice. Again, it's just a lot of good information all in one spot there. All right. Almost done here, I promise. I do want to show you real quick with the portal, when you go to sign in, when you go to usac.org/erate, all right, when you go to sign in, username is your email address. I do want to encourage you, when you go to log in, you will see on the screen either here or when you get to the next step, what's called the dashboard. Automatically, with this program, they do use MFA, a multi-factor authentication. So because your username is your email address, that's the initial way of getting those codes, right? What I suggest, though, once you log in, if you're a brand new user, you have to log in at least the first time. When you go back the second time or later, you'll see an option to add getting text messages, all right, to receive that code. Over the summer, we ran into an issue, an applicant, they got hacked and it took down their email system. There was something that they needed to file in the portal, but because they could not access their email, they could not get into the portal at all. All right. So I'm changing my guidance a bit here. I strongly suggest that you go in and you add texting as an option to get that MFA code. All right, because if they had done that, they would have been able to log in, do what they needed to in the portal. It caused a very stressful situation for a while. All right, now once you do log in, this has been a little confusing for some folks. When you first log in, it says, okay, here's the dashboard. It doesn't look like a menu, but it really is. It just looks like two descriptive paragraphs, right? So it lists first the E-rate portal, and then it could list the cybersecurity pilot if you're, a pilot participant. It also still lists the emergency connectivity fund, all right? It really is a menu option. So to get into Epic, you come up to that top option there, right? Click, takes you to the portal. Okay. Now, a couple of things here. So it's you're logging in. Are you the account administrator? The quickest way to know that is simply if you see manage users up in this right-hand corner. All right. These are some shortcuts. Manage users, only the account administrator will see that option. Now, under the section there, let me go back here. Sorry, making you dizzy here. All right, so as we scroll down on that landing page, there's a section called My Entities. All right, and so if you are a library system, the very first one in the list will be the system itself, the build entity. All right, and then each of those library sites will be listed. Each of your branches will be listed. The main library also has a separate entity number as a child entity. All right, so the library system is simply the umbrella, all right, the parent. All right, but if we click on the library system, it's going to give us some summary information. First off, it's going to say, okay, here's the name of the individual who is the account administrator. All right, this is something that Christine or I can, we both have state coordinator logins. So if you don't have a login yet, and maybe you've had a change in staff, either one of us, we can look up to let you know who is listed as the account administrator. All right, and the steps to, to get that changed. All right, but again, we can look that up for you. There's also a general contact that's listed. You might want to update that. Some emails only go to the general contact. All right, so you want to make sure that that information is current. Now, really important here, if you are going to apply for Category 2, when you scroll down at the very bottom of that page, it says, here's your Category 2 budget information. This is the total, the sum of all the square footage, right, for all of your library sites, right? So look at that number. Does it look correct, right? If you say, well, we have a lot more square footage than that, right? That tells you need to go back and look at each of your library branches, right? Main and each of the branches, to make sure, update the square footage. If you look at that and it's, yep, that's correct, then you're good to go, all right? Because that information is already in the portal. All right, so if you go in, either, update, make changes to your square footage, you can go in and check your Cat 2 budget. Now, USAC has not updated some of this yet, all right? They're working on getting that done when the admin window opens, all right? But once you go in, you update the information. When you get to that summary page, you'll see some menu options. You'll see discount rate as one of the options there. All right, that's something that I would wait until after the admin window closes. But you can go in and verify your discount rate, because remember, you're at the mercy of the school district, right? When whatever information that they put in about their enrollment and lunch information. So once they, after the close of the this admin window in early mid-January, go in and just verify what your discount rate is. Has that changed? All right, but if we click where it says Cat 2 budget, we have to click a second time, get Cat 2 budget. And now we're going to see a section here for the 26 through 2030. All right, this new 5-year. It's going to show you, here's the forecast. And again, USAC's working on updating this with those new, that per allocation. All right, it's going to initially say forecast because these numbers haven't been validated yet. All right, but it'll show you the Cat 2 budget. If you want to, maybe, you're coming in behind someone else. Did they apply for Cat 2? How much of the previous Cat 2 budget did they use? You will see that data listed as well. All right. Now, if you see that, that square footage is off, right? You don't know, okay, which site is incorrect, or are there some branches where maybe there's no data yet, right? We have to click on each library site. It's under that My Entities, each one individually. There's no place to update all of them at the same time. All right, so we'll start here with our main library. I click on that. If it's in blue, it's a hyperlink. All right, and then I can come over here. I get a menu option called Manage Organization. All right, prior to clicking on Manage Organization, if I click on the library name, it's going to give me a summary for that site. Now I can scroll down and see that summary information. What's the square footage for that building? And then if I see that I need to change it, I click on Manage Organization. Now it's just this really long page. All right, so most of this, you're not touching, it's already in there, but you can verify the street address, make sure that's correct. Just keep scrolling down. There's a place where you'll indicate, is this the main library or not? Again, that's already checked for you. All right, but here's the all important square footage field, right? It says square footage, you plug in that number. All right, and then be prepared, right, to to prove that information. It will also, if it's designated as the main library, it's already associated. What's the school district associated with that main library? All right, so any changes, if you make it, such as square footage, make that change, and then you click on submit. All right, really easy to do. Okay, next steps. Again, we've talked about this. Update your information, right? Put in that square footage. Start looking at your contracts, anything new that you might, want to ask for. Start that planning now, all right? Make your plan, follow your plan. Questions, and here's all the contact information for myself.
Lori puts her contact information up there because she intends that you use it.
Yes,
honestly, it's not one of those things where a person tosses up their contact info and hopes that nobody no, Lori means it. So, and I mean it too. This is the fourth time, 21, 22, 23, 24, actually fifth time I've been through this training with you, Lori. And for folks who are just doing this the first time, it's a lot. It is a lot. And it started making sense to me about the third time through. So hang on, it's okay. You'll be fine.
Don't panic, because we actually, it is common. You are referred to as an E-rate newbie until you've had 3 full years under your belt. Just the way it is. Because again, you're dealing with 3 years at any given time.
And you're not really a veteran until you've done it for at least 10, I think. A couple things before folks go. Thank you for sticking around.
Thank you so much.
A lot of information here, but just remember, if you have one location, Oakland does the category 1 for you. So you just have to worry about category 2, and do worry about category 2 because it's really worthwhile. Please show up for those additional trainings that Lori's going to do. The other thing is, if you have branch locations and you don't want to get into this, we have at Oakland a managed branch program that we will do the E-rate for you, manage the circuit, deal with the vendor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is that. There are some stipulations with it. So thirdly, there are wonderful folks out there, and Lori actually does this too, who do consulting for E-rate. So if you're looking at this and you go, oh my gosh, I don't even, there are reputable folks who can help you with this. If you decide you don't want to go the easy CABIO route, you don't want to go the managed branch connection route, and you do need to have branch connections in some way, shape, or form, there's help. So and honestly, you can do it. Lori can help you enough that you can do that with the training. So thanks for sticking around. I appreciate your time. Lori appreciates your time. I know we can
Pleasure.
probably end the recording unless there's anything exciting.
Stop recording, making it official.